are moments from that trip that I have replayed so many times in my head that I am not completely sure anymore whether I am remembering the experience or just the memory of it. But the stick figure is always there, crystal clear, sitting on the ash like it had been waiting for me to wake up. My two friends, Garrett and Miles, and I had been planning this section of the Appalachian Trail for about 8 months. We had been hiking together since college. We were not rookies. Between the three of us, we had logged close to 300 miles of trail over the years, scattered across different states, different seasons. We knew how to read weather, how to hang a bear bag, how to navigate when the blazes got inconsistent. I say all of this because I want you to understand. What happened did not happen to three people who were spooked by their own shadows in the dark. We were experienced. We were level-headed, and none of us had an explanation then, and none of us have one now. We started that trip on a Saturday in late September. The drive north took about 2.5 hours, and we got to the trailhead just before noon. The air was already that particular late autumn cool that settles into the mountains ahead of the valleys. And the leaves were turning. Red and gold and orange and brown, every color you associate with that time of year, layered through the canopy above us as we packed up and started walking. The light coming through the trees was soft and warm. The trail was in good shape, dry, well-marked, a light dusting of fallen leaves on the packed earth. The first 6 miles were everything a September hike is supposed to be. We stopped twice, once to eat, once to sit on a rock outcropping that opened out over a long valley and just be quiet for a few minutes. I remember thinking clearly, sitting on that rock, that this was exactly why we kept doing this. The way the world gets simplified out here, the way the noise and the speed of everything else just drops away, and what you are left with is a trail and the people walking it with you. We were about 6 miles in, maybe 6.5 when I saw it. It was sitting in the exact center of the trail, not off to the side, not leaning against a tree, dead center of the path, propped upright against a moss-covered rock that sat at about knee height. A bundle of sticks assembled into a rough human figure. 2 long sticks formed the legs, lashed together at the top. Shorter ones crossed perpendicular at the chest for arms. And at the top, a small cluster of twigs had been gathered and bound into a rounded approximation of a head, tied with a thin strip of bark that had been peeled from what looked like a birch tree. The whole thing stood about 14 inches tall. I stopped walking without meaning to. Garrett almost walked into the back of me. I crouched down without touching it at first. Just looked. The binding at each joint was tight and intentional. The sticks were not fresh. They were dry, slightly darkened at the ends, the way wood gets when it has been sitting in a dry spot for a few weeks. Someone had made this with purpose and patience. This was not a bored hiker idly arranging sticks while they waited for a companion. This was deliberate construction. Miles said what we were all thinking. He looked at it flatly and said, "That is a Blair Witch thing." We laughed. The joke was the right pressure valve for the moment, and I was glad he made it. I picked it up, turned it over. Nothing hidden inside it. No note, no marking. Just dry sticks and birch bark. A craft project that someone had left in the precise center of a trail miles from the nearest road or town. I cannot tell you exactly why I decided to keep it. I think some part of me thought it was interesting. I thought people at home might find it cool. I slid it into the outer pocket of my pack, zipped it closed, and we kept walking. By the time we set up camp that evening, the stick figure was almost completely out of my mind. We made camp in a flat clearing about 30 feet off the trail, a spot we had used once before on a trip 2 summers prior. It was not an official campsite, but it was a known one, used enough that the ground was packed flat and the fire ring was already established. We got the blaze going just as the last light was leaving the sky. For a few hours after that, it was just the 3 of us, the fire, and miles of dark trees on every side. I am going to describe the night because I want you to understand what it would take for the explanation to be innocent. We sat at the fire until close to 11. The woods around us were quiet in the way that deep woods are quiet. Not silent, but full of small sounds that stay in their lane. Wind through the high branches, an owl somewhere to the east, the fire settling. There were no other sounds, no footsteps, no voices, no indication that any other person was within miles of where we sat. I went to bed at 11:15. I do not remember lying awake for very long. The cold air and the long day conspired, and I was asleep quickly, deeply. I heard nothing in the night. Not once did I stir. Not once did I hear anything that pulled me toward consciousness. I slept the way you sleep when you have spent a full day walking in mountain air. Completely and without dreaming, I was the first one awake. I unzipped my tent at a little past 6 in the morning. The sky was just starting to gray at the edges. I pulled on my boots without fully tying them and shuffled toward the fire ring to get the camp stove going. My eyes were not fully adjusted. The world was that cold, still blue that exists for about 20 minutes before dawn gets serious. I looked down at the fire ring. Sitting on top of the cold ash was a stick figure. I stood very still for a long time. It was about 14 inches tall. 2 long sticks for legs, shorter ones crossed at the chest, a cluster of twigs at the top, bound with a thin strip of pale bark. I walked to my pack. I unzipped the outer pocket. The original stick figure was inside it, exactly where I had left it, undisturbed. I carried it back to the fire ring and crouched down. I held the new figure in one hand and the trail figure in the other, and I looked at them side by side in the low morning light for what must have been a full 2 minutes. They were near perfect matches. Same height, same proportions, the arm sticks crossed at the same angle. The head binding done in the same method with the same pale birch bark. The only differences were the specific twigs chosen. Slightly different lengths, slightly different species, but the design, the construction, the intent were identical. My hands were shaking slightly when Garrett unzipped his tent. He saw my face before he saw what I was holding. I did not say anything. I just walked to him and held up both figures, one in each hand. He stared at them for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Where did that one come from?" It was not a question. He already knew the answer was that I did not know. We woke Miles. We stood together at the fire ring in the early morning cold, and we asked each other every logical question you ask in that situation. Did you get up in the night? Did either of you make this as a joke? Think about whether there is any way you could have done this that you have already forgotten. We asked each other with complete seriousness, the way people do when they genuinely need to know. Garrett swore. Miles swore. I believed them, not because I am an easy believer, but because I have known both of these men for more than a decade, and I know the face each of them makes when they are lying, and neither of them was making that face. But what bothered me more than the where was the how. To replicate the trail figure with that degree of accuracy, you would need to see it. You would need to study it and model your construction against it. My original was in a zipped pocket of my pack. My pack was inside my tent. To access it in the dark, someone would have needed to unzip my tent, unzip my pack, extract the figure, study it by flashlight without waking me, reconstruct it from scratch in the dark, return the original, re-zip the pack, re-zip the tent, and walk back out without any of us hearing a single sound. We were miles from the nearest road, miles from the nearest town. We had passed 2 other hikers going the opposite direction early that afternoon. We had seen no signs of anyone else in the area since. We packed up quickly that morning, not frantically, but none of us suggested taking our time. The fire ring sat behind us as we shouldered our packs, and I looked back at it once before the trail curved and it disappeared from view. The ash pile, the ring of stones, the spot where someone or something had been standing in the night while we slept 4 feet away. I kept both figures. I packed them both out in my bag, and I have them still, sitting in a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet. The wood has darkened with age. The birch bark at the joints has dried and begun to curl at the edges. They are still nearly identical to each other. Garrett's theory, developed over the weeks after we got home, was that someone lived out there. Not in a house or a shelter, just out there in the deep woods. Someone who had their own system, their own rituals, and that this person had their own relationship to the stick figures. Maybe they made them as markers, as territory signals, and when they found that one had been taken from the trail, they left a replacement at the nearest campsite as a kind of acknowledgement, a response. Miles preferred the simpler explanation of a prank, which required a stranger to be carrying a spare stick figure on the off chance someone had picked up the first. I have my own theory, and I have never said it out loud to either of them, because it does not fit neatly into any rational framework, and I have never been comfortable being the person who says things outside of rational frameworks. But I have turned those 2 figures over in my hands enough times, in enough different lights, that I have had to let myself think it. I think something in those woods wanted me to know it had been watching. Not the camp, not the fire, me specifically. The person who picked up the figure, the person who carried it 6 miles. The person who slept with it in the outer pocket of their bag 3 feet from their head. I do not know what it wanted beyond that. Maybe just acknowledgement. Maybe just to be seen the way it had been seeing. I still hike the Appalachian Trail. I go back every year, usually in September, usually with Garrett and Miles. But I do not pick up anything I find on the trail anymore. Not sticks, not stones, not figures, not anything that looks like it was placed where it was for a reason, because I think those woods remember what you take. and I think they know how to respond. I have worked with a youth outdoor leadership program for close to 9 years. I say that first because I want you to understand that when you spend enough nights in the woods supervising kids, you become comfortable with the dark in a way that most people are not. You stop hearing every snapped twig as a threat. You stop cataloging every shadow. After 9 years of camping trips and overnight excursions and wilderness weekends, the woods at night had become for me a familiar place. Not safe exactly because you never fully let your guard down, but familiar, known. That familiarity is the only reason I know with complete certainty that what I saw that night was not one of my people. The trip was a 5-day camping excursion in a forested area in the upper Midwest, a stretch of state woodland that the program had used for years. About 60 kids, ranging in age from 12 to 16, along with 8 adult leaders including me. The site was well established. Log cabin meeting area, a central fire pit, tent pads scattered through the trees, a main path that connected everything and then dissolved into natural trail at the edges of camp. Every trip we ran, we did what we called a night game on the 3rd evening. The concept was simple and it was effective. The kids had to complete a series of tasks spread out through the woods after dark, navigating with minimal light, and the leaders would be hidden along the route to scare them. Masks, costumes, noise, the whole thing. It was the highlight of every trip. The kids talked about it for weeks afterward. Some of them told us years later it was the most memorable thing they had ever done. The 3rd night of this particular trip, we had a new wrinkle in the game. 2 leaders were stationed deeper into the woods than we had ever positioned people before, past the main trail break and into the section of forest we generally kept the kids out of. Dense, dark, the kind of terrain where your flashlight beam does not carry the same way because the trees are too close together. I volunteered for one of the deep positions because I knew that section of the woods better than most of the other leaders. I had walked it during daylight to check for hazards at the start of the trip. We suited up, masks and costumes in a range. Some of the leaders had gone elaborate. Some had kept it simple. I had a rubber mask and a dark jacket. We took our positions at around 9 in the evening, just after full dark. The game started. I could hear the kids in the distance, their voices and the crunch of their footsteps on the trail. Occasionally, the beam of a flashlight would swing through the trees 100 yards away. The screams started a few minutes in. Good screams. The kind that meant the other leaders were doing their jobs. I settled in against a wide oak at the edge of a small natural clearing, maybe 40 feet from the main trail. That is when I saw the shadow for the first time. It was off to my left, deeper into the trees, just a shape in my peripheral vision. My first thought was that it was another leader who had repositioned. That happened sometimes. People moved around to extend the scare. I did not look directly at it. I was focused on my zone, watching for the first group of kids to come down the trail. 15 minutes passed. 20. I caught the shape again, same area, still just in the periphery, still in roughly the same spot. Which meant if it was a leader, they had not repositioned at all since I had first spotted them. Just standing, between 2 trees slightly back from them, in the darkest part of that section of the woods. I should have gone to look then. I did not. The game ran for another 30 minutes. By the end, the main wave of kids had moved through, the screams had died down, and we were getting the signal from the camp director that it was time to wrap up and come back. I clicked my flashlight to signal acknowledgement. I started walking back toward camp, and then I stopped. I thought about that shape, about how long it had been standing in the same spot, about how it had not moved the entire time the game was running, how none of the leaders, to my knowledge, had been stationed in that particular section. I turned around. I walked toward the tree line where I had seen it. About 20 feet in, I turned on my flashlight. There was a person standing between 2 pine trees approximately 15 feet in front of me. They were not moving. What they were wearing is what I have thought about every single night since. It was a torn burlap sack, draped over the body like a loose garment, coming down past the waist. And the head, I'm going to try to describe this as accurately as I can. The head was covered with what looked like multiple white plastic bags, the kind from a grocery store, pulled over each other and tied together somehow, forming a lumpen, opaque covering over the entire face and skull. No eyes visible, no features, just that white plastic, gathering and creasing where the air pushed against it, catching the beam of my flashlight. The figure did not react to the light. It did not move. It stood there between those 2 pines, and I stood there with my light on it. And neither of us did anything for what I think was close to 10 seconds, but felt much longer. I said, "Hey," My voice came out quieter than I intended it. Nothing. I turned and I walked fast back to camp. Not running. I want to be accurate. I did not run, but I was not strolling. When I got back to the fire, every single leader was already there. I stood at the edge of the group and I scanned them. Every mask and costume accounted for. Nobody in burlap, nobody with white plastic bags, and more importantly, nobody looked like they had just come from the deep woods. They were all standing around the fire, all in various states of pulling off their costumes and laughing with the kids. I asked the group, as casually as I could manage, if anyone had been positioned on the far left of the trail, past the second marker. Nobody had. I described again as calmly as I could what I had seen. The burlap, the plastic bags, the stillness. They looked at me the way people look at someone who has said something they cannot quite process. The camp director pointed out that the nearest road was more than 4 miles away, that there was no public access to that section of the forest, that the only people with any reason to be out there were standing around that fire. We checked on the kids. We did a head count. Everyone was accounted for and fine. Nobody had seen anything unusual during the game. We reported it the following morning to the park office that managed the surrounding land. They sent someone out to walk the area during the day. They did not find anything. No signs of habitation. No footprints they could identify as conclusive. The burlap figure, whoever or whatever it had been, was simply gone. I have worked many trips since that one. I have been back to that same site 3 times. Each time I do the standard preparatory walk of the whole area the day we arrive. I check the trail sections, the perimeter, the deep forest zones beyond the main path. On one of those subsequent trips the year after, I walked into that section of trees during the afternoon. I walked to the 2 pines where I had aimed my flashlight. I stood in the spot where the figure had been standing and I looked back toward camp. From that position, through the trees, you can see the fire pit clearly. You can see the tent pads. You can see the paths between them. Whatever had been standing there that night had an unobstructed view of our entire campsite. I think about that a lot. I think about how long it must have been there before I noticed it, and how long it might have stayed after I turned and walked away. I think about the fact that it never moved toward me, and I have never been able to decide if that is comforting or if it is the most frightening part of all. The outdoor program is still running. The kids still go on trips. We still do the night game. I still volunteer for the deep position in the woods, but I never stand with my back to the trees for very long anymore. And I always sweep my flashlight in a full circle before I settle into my spot, because that figure taught me one thing I could not have learned any other way. You are never the only one watching. After my friends from college scattered to different cities, different time zones, different lives, I started going camping alone. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because I know that is the thing people will react to first. And I understand why. But the truth is that for several years it was the thing I looked forward to most. The site I used most often was remote enough to be genuinely quiet, but not so isolated that it felt reckless. A spot I knew well, that I had visited many times with groups, that sat at the end of a trail most people bypassed because there were more accessible campsites nearby. That remoteness was what I loved about it. The silence. The fact that I almost always had it to myself. I had been there alone a handful of times before the night I am going to describe. Nothing had ever happened that gave me any unease. I had seen the occasional fellow hiker passing through. I had heard distant vehicles on the fire road. I had cooked my own food and read my book and slept and woken up, and everything had always been ordinary. The evening started exactly that way. I arrived at the site in the mid-afternoon, set up my tent on the flat pad I always used, and spent the remaining daylight hours doing what I usually did. Reading, cooking a simple meal, watching the light change through the canopy. By the time dark settled in, I had the small fire going, and I was in that comfortable, slightly drowsy state that a long solo hike produces. I heard the footsteps at around 9, coming from the trail direction. Steady, not trying to be quiet, which at the time I registered as a good sign. I looked up from the fire. A man stepped into the edge of the firelight. He was in his 40s, I would say. Solidly built. He had a backpack on, but it was small. The kind of small that strikes you as wrong for someone who is supposed to be hiking or camping. Just a small dark pack worn on both shoulders. He was dressed casually. Dark jacket. He did not have any identifying clothing that I could see in the firelight. He said he was a park ranger. He introduced himself with a name I no longer remember. He said he had been doing a sweep of the area and had seen my fire. I said hello. I was polite. He was friendly enough in tone, easygoing, not aggressive. He asked a few standard-sounding questions. How long I was staying, whether I had the proper permit for the site, whether I had seen any wildlife during the hike in. I answered everything honestly. Then he said something that shifted everything. He told me there had been some reports of activity in the woods about a mile further along the trail. His phrasing was vague, just activity, something worth checking out. And he suggested that I might want to come with him to take a look. At night, he framed it as a kind of invitation. Casual. He said it would not take long and it might be interesting. He gestured back toward the dark trail behind him. I said no. I kept my voice level. I thanked him. I said I was settled in for the night and would stay at the site. He held my gaze for a moment. Just a moment. Then he nodded and said something like, "Fair enough," and told me to stay alert. Then he walked back the way he had come and disappeared into the dark. I sat at that fire for a long time afterward without moving very much. There were things about the interaction that had been fine. Plenty of people have completely normal, harmless encounters with this description, and nothing comes of them. I know that, but I kept turning it over and over in my mind, trying to locate the specific thing that had set off the low alarm inside my chest. And eventually I found it. It was the way he looked at me when I said no. It was not aggressive. It was not angry. It was something more neutral than that, and somehow the neutrality was worse. Like the outcome did not matter to him one way or the other. Like my declining was just information, not a disappointment. I did not sleep easily that night. Every sound had a different quality. The silence between sounds felt different. I kept the fire burning higher than I normally would have. When I got home and spoke to the authorities, I described the encounter. They searched the site and the trail area. They found nothing. They confirmed that there was no ranger assigned to that area with the name he had given me. They looked at the permit records and there was nothing that matched his description. He was not a park ranger. Then he said something that shifted everything. He told me there had been some reports of activity in the woods about a mile further along the trail. His phrasing was vague, just activity, something worth checking out. And he suggested that I might want to come with him to take a look. At night, he framed it as a kind of invitation. Casual. He said it would not take long and it might be interesting. He gestured back toward the dark trail behind him. I said no. I kept my voice level. I thanked him. I said I was settled in for the night and would stay at the site. He held my gaze for a moment. Just a moment. Then he nodded and said something like, "Fair enough," and told me to stay alert. Then he walked back the way he had come and disappeared into the dark. I sat at that fire for a long time afterward without moving very much. There were things about the interaction that had been fine. Plenty of people have completely normal, harmless encounters with this description, and nothing comes of them. I know that, but I kept turning it over and over in my mind, trying to locate the specific thing that had set off the low alarm inside my chest. And eventually I found it. It was the way he looked at me when I said no. It was not aggressive. It was not angry. It was something more neutral than that, and somehow the neutrality was worse. Like the outcome did not matter to him one way or the other. Like my declining was just information, not a disappointment. I did not sleep easily that night. Every sound had a different quality. The silence between sounds felt different. I kept the fire burning higher than I normally would have. When I got home and spoke to the authorities, I described the encounter. They searched the site and the trail area. They found nothing. They confirmed that there was no ranger assigned to that area with the name he had given me. They looked at the permit records and there was nothing that matched his description. He was not a park ranger. There is one more thing. During the investigation, I was told that another hiker had been reported as possibly having been in that general trail corridor around the same time. Someone who had told family members they were going out for a few days and had not checked in. I do not know what became of that inquiry. I have searched for follow-up information and I have not found a resolution to it. What I know is this. A man lied about his identity and tried to walk me into a dark forest trail at night, alone. And I said no, and I am here to tell you about it. I still camp. I have not stopped. But I never go back to that site, and I have never again gone alone. There is something I think about late at night that I cannot shake. He was not looking for me specifically. I was just the person who happened to be there with a fire going. The person who was alone and settled in. The person who could have been convinced under slightly different circumstances if he had been slightly more charming, if the night had been slightly darker. If I had been slightly less tired and therefore slightly less alert, the person who might have said yes and picked up a flashlight and followed him into the trees. I think about the other hiker who had not checked in. I think about whether they said yes. I think about whether saying yes or no was ever really the difference, or whether once he had seen my fire he had already decided. But I did say no, and I kept saying it. And eventually he walked back into the dark and did not come back. My family owns about 200 acres of wooded land in the eastern part of North Carolina. The property has been in the family for generations. Nobody lives on it anymore. The farmhouse that stood there until the mid-90s was torn down, and what remains is mostly second-growth forest. A few overgrown clearings where fields used to be, and a pond that sits in the low center of the land. We go out regularly, hunting season, occasional camping, family gatherings in the summer where we set up tents in the biggest clearing, and spend a few days just being out of the world. I grew up going to that land. It is as familiar to me as anywhere I have ever been. And for most of my life I felt completely comfortable there. That started to change about 6 years ago. Gradually, so gradually that I did not recognize it as a change at first. I thought it was just my own mood on various trips, my stress level, how much I had slept. But over time, the thing that I kept bringing home from that land was an unease I could not fully articulate. A low sense of wrongness that sat in my chest during the quieter hours, usually in the late afternoon when the shadows were starting to lengthen, or at night when the tree line was close and dark on all sides of wherever we were sitting. I mentioned it to my dad the second summer it happened. He got quiet when I said it. He said he had been feeling the same thing for 2 years. We asked my uncle. He nodded before we even finished the sentence. The three of us had been independently experiencing the same thing on that land. And none of us had said anything to the others, because none of us had known how to describe it without sounding irrational. What do you say? That you feel watched? That the forest feels like it is watching you back? That is not a thing you bring to a practical conversation easily. But here's the specific detail that moved it from feeling to fact. On a trip in August roughly 4.5 years ago, my younger cousin was walking the southern fence line. She was alone. It was mid-afternoon, full daylight, no particular reason for alarm. She called me over to show me something she had found along the fence line, tucked in against one of the old wooden posts. It was a cigarette butt, then 2 more, a foot apart, pressed into the soil in the way that suggests they were stubbed out there deliberately, rather than dropped in passing. The fence line is not visible from the road. It is not visible from any trail or path. To stand at that particular post, you would have to walk a deliberate route across 2 overgrown fields and through a thicket of second-growth pine. There is no reason for a stranger to be there. No reason for anyone to be at that fence post. We found 2 more sets of stubs that afternoon at different points along the boundary. My dad bought 4 motion-triggered trail cameras that winter. We mounted them along the property. One at the main gate path, one along the southern fence line, one pointed toward the pond, one at the western edge where the property borders national forest land. The cameras ran all winter and into the spring, downloading every few weeks when we made the drive out to check them. Most of what they captured was deer, raccoons, the occasional fox. The movements of small animals through the underbrush at night. Ordinary wildlife footage. The kind of thing you set trail cameras to see. In the spring, April, a Saturday, I remember because it was raining when we drove out. My dad pulled the memory cards and loaded them onto his laptop at the kitchen table of the house back in town. We went through the footage in sequence. Deer, more deer. A coyote we had not known was on the property. A wild turkey. And then, on the western edge camera, the one pointed at the national forest boundary, my dad stopped scrolling. He did not say anything. He just turned the laptop so I could see the screen. The footage was stamped at 4:37 in the afternoon. The light in the image was the low gold of late afternoon, the kind that makes the shadows long. The western tree line was visible on the right side of the frame. And coming out of those trees, moving slowly, deliberately, clearly familiar with the terrain, was a man. He had a rifle. A long rifle slung across the front of his body, held at a ready position. He was wearing camouflage clothing from head to foot. He walked out of the national forest tree line and moved about 20 yards into our property before stopping. Then he crouched. In the low vegetation between 2 young pine trees, he settled into a kneeling position and raised the rifle. He was not pointing it at any animal. He was pointing it toward the center of the property, toward the clearing where we camped in the summer, toward where our tents went. The footage ran for 22 minutes. For 22 continuous minutes, this man knelt in the vegetation at the edge of our property, with a rifle pointed at our camping area. The clearing was empty. This was April, not camping season. No one was there. But the point he was aiming at was exactly where our camp was in summer. Then he stood. He turned. He walked back into the national forest trees and was gone. We went through the rest of the footage and found him on 3 other visits. all within the previous 4 months. Same approach, same camouflage, same rifle, same kneeling position in the same general area. Every time he held that position for between 15 and 30 minutes, aimed at our camp clearing and then walked back out. On one of those visits, the timestamp was a Saturday afternoon in late July. We had been camping on that property that same weekend. Our tents were in that clearing. My cousins, my uncle, my father, and I. 6 people total. My youngest cousin was 11 years old. We were there, in those tents, while he was kneeling 70 yards away with a rifle. I do not know why he never fired. I do not know if it was because we were not doing something he was waiting for, or because the sight of us simply was not enough to trigger whatever he was there to do, or because something else held him back. I have no way of knowing his thinking. I have no way of knowing his intent. What I know is what the camera showed. We filed a report. Law enforcement walked the national forest boundary and could not find conclusive evidence of specific violations beyond trespassing, and even that was murky at the boundary. They increased drive-bys on the access road for a few months. The cameras have not caught him since, though we left them running. We still go to the property. My family would not surrender it, but we changed things. There are more people now, never fewer than 4. The camping spot moved to a different clearing, one that cannot be seen from the western tree line. We check the motion footage before we go out and when we are there. And now, when I feel that particular low unease while I'm sitting by the fire at dusk, that specific feeling I have felt on that land for years, that I once convinced myself was nothing, I know better than to dismiss it. We were not imagining it. We never were. The camera showed us that our instincts had been right every single time. Someone was always there in the trees. We just did not know until we had proof.